Printers, Part 1. In this nugget, we'll introduce printers with Part 1. We'll start off by first of all discussing the various types of printer technologies, dot matrix and other impact printers, laser printing, all of those kinds of different printers that you can use. And then more specifically with the laser printers, we'll look at the 6 basic steps of a print job and its process. We'll also take a look at the printer options and upgrades. What kind of things can you add to a printer to maybe optimize its performance or allow it to print better? And how do you actually hook that printer up to your computer or to the network? We'll look at the various interfaces that are available. A few years ago, a colleague of mine who was responsible for supporting computers in an office building got blamed for a printer problem. Here's what happened. He got to work, and he usually works on the 5th floor. So he normally goes to his cubicle, sits down his laptop bag, checks things out and sees if he has any messages. And then he takes his coffee mug and goes down to the 4th floor where the coffee pot is. So he goes to the 4th floor, fills up his coffee mug, and makes his way back up to the 5th floor. The whole thing takes like a minute. As soon as he gets back to his desk, his phone extension rings. He picks up the phone, and someone down on the 4th floor says, "What did you do to our printer?" Well, I just got here. I got my coffee, and I got to my cubicle. I haven't done anything yet. I haven't touched anything. Yes, you did. I know, because you were down here, and I saw you, and now our printer's not working. Isn't that the way it goes? You get blamed for everything, whether it's your fault or not. I guess just the very fact that he walked by it and his shadow fell on that printer must have caused it to stop working properly. And apparently, the folks over at CompTIA also think that printing is a huge part of an A-plus technician's responsibility. And you can tell that if you ever go to CompTIA's website and look at the A-plus objectives, not just for the main exam, but also for all the other exams, which I've reviewed for you early in this series, you'll see that printing appears many times, and there's probably not one subject that's covered more frequently and in more various aspects than printing. Regardless of that, however, printing is actually very simple in a lot of different ways. Some of the things that we'll talk about in this nugget we've already discussed, but I want to go ahead and first of all start off by talking about the various types of printers that are available to us. And you can see here, the first one we're looking at is dot matrix, which I think, by the way, that I have aptly illustrated with my little dots here to create the word dot matrix. I don't even know if you can read it, but you get the point of what I was trying to do. What works with a dot matrix printer? What happens here is there's going to be 9 to 24 pins. Just take a paper clip, if you will, and if you straighten it out and look at the blunt end of that paper clip, you see just the hard end of that paper clip. It's really great for doing things like popping balloons and stuff like that. Well, anyway, there are pins that are about the size or look something like the end of a paper clip might, and they're all lined up. So if we were looking at a print head for a dot matrix printer, we might see, 1, 2, 3, 4, and this goes on to about 9 pins at a minimum. Lost track of how many I had there, but anyway, you get the idea there. You have a bunch of little different pins that appear on that print head. And then what happens here is, if we take these print heads, or these pins, and we shoot them, and something electronically back here, and there's an electrical impulse that takes place that identifies which pin to fire, then it goes through a printer ribbon, usually is what we see right here, and then back here, we would have the paper, and then after that, we would have usually a roller or some kind of a hard surface. So the pin strikes the ribbon, which is saturated with ink. Then because of that impact, and this is also known as a dot matrix printer, is also known as an impact printer because it uses the violent force of these pins hitting through here. And then this saturated ink hits the paper, which is held in place and is able to accept that indentation or that impact because it has a hard roller, rubberized roller, behind it. And the main thing that makes this happen, of course, is the pins that we see here and the ribbon. Usually there's going to be between 9 and 24 pins. If you have a 9-pin printer, usually that's referred to as a draft printer because it will print words out legibly, and you should be able to get general productivity work done with it. But you're not going to get high letter quality out of a 9-pin printer usually. You can go to 24 pins, and with the 24-pin printer, you can't often get letter quality print. Letter quality, meaning that on casual examination of the letters, for your print out a memo or something like that, you couldn't really tell that it was made with a dot matrix. It might look very similar to what it would look like if it were created with a typewriter, for example. And then you may also see some other oddball printers that have neither 9 nor 24 pins, but some number in between perhaps. And that just depends upon the use of that printer. But it's not important to know exactly how many pins each type of printer has, but usually it's somewhere in that range. And then, of course, the cloth ribbon that we saw here is what makes it happen. It's saturated with ink, and I already discussed that. And then usually we'll use paper that is made for a tractor feed. Here's the way that happens. Inside that printer, there will be two wheels, and these wheels will have, for lack of a better word, spikes on them. Oh, look, I think I drew a kitty cat there. Anyway, we get these spikes that go all the way around these wheels. Okay, and in these spikes, what happens is there's perforated paper. And you've seen this before, so I won't go into a great deal of detail on this, unless you're really young and you're not old like me, where we used to use these things all the time. And you have perforations that go right down here, so you can tear off these perforated sides of the paper where these holes are. These holes go into these spikes on the tractor feed wheel, and that's what rotates to allow the paper to go through the printer. And you probably will still see these kinds of things if you go to, I don't know, the auto parts store and you buy an alternator or a solenoid, and they print out a multi-part copy of your receipt, which may be done for purposes of warranty and things like this. Many times, doctors' offices are also still using this kind of thing as well. And the reason why some businesses will still use this kind of a printer, a dot matrix printer, is because they might want multi-part copies. So when you go to the doctor's office and they print out your invoice or your test results or whatever it is that they give to you, there'll be a copy for the doctor's file, and you usually get the yellow copy, which is almost illegible, but the good copy usually goes in the doctor's file, and then there's a pink copy which goes who knows where. I don't know where that goes. Probably goes to Big Brother or something like that. So we get multiple copies out of this dot matrix type of a printer, because when it hits the ribbon, hits the paper, because it's an impact, if there's multiple pieces of paper in here that are designed to be able to receive that impact, then what happens is the ink hits the top copy, but just the pressure alone will create a mark on the second and third copies, or however many copies there are there. And it's just a chemical nature of that type of paper that will cause that mark to transfer through. And then we very frequently use these for retail purposes. You might still see stores where the cash register receipt prints out, and you can hear it going, that kind of a sound that goes through as it's being printed. Well, that might not be exactly what it sounds like. Maybe it's a little bit more like but anyway, you get the idea. There's something that goes through where we have retail stores that use these. And then we also have the advantage of configuration simplicity. Dot matrix printers are usually very, very easy to work with. First of all, when it prints something out on a page, and here's just a page here, when it prints this line out, whatever text goes in that line, in terms of the programming and the complications of the printer, there's not that much to it. It's a very simple language that spits that out. When you work with other printers, such as laser printers, for example, it has to be able to calculate the appearance of the entire page at once, whereas dot matrix printers just do this line, and all I have to know is which pin to push forward when the head goes across the page. As far as the A+ technician's responsibility with this, it's usually pretty simple as well. The drivers for a dot matrix printer are usually very, very simple. In fact, for many common printers, all current versions of Windows already have drivers installed that will allow them to print to some very common ones. And beyond that, we usually just plug it into a port and let the thing go. A lot of these dot matrix printers, by the way, and I'll just make a quick note down here, are often serial port printers. Again, especially if you're working in a retail environment, manufacturing, something like this. Now, in terms of the kind of maintenance and troubleshooting that you might have to address with a dot matrix printer, I normally see two things happen here. Number one, this ribbon will get worn out, and eventually it won't have the same ink saturation after a while, and so you may need to replace that ink ribbon. If you're like a lot of small businesses, then that ribbon will get beaten to death to the point where it's almost completely transparent before some people will replace them because they don't want to spend the money on them. But that often results in very faint copies, which are frustrating for the customer. However, if it's a multi-part form, of course, the back copies there won't be affected because they don't need the ink anyway. Another thing that you'll see, actually there's two or three things. Another thing that you'll see is this platen at the back or this roller at the back, sometimes with dot matrix type printers, gets misaligned. You see, it has to be exactly in parallel with the print head. And if it gets skewed, so it goes at an angle, and I'm exaggerating this angle here, it's actually not very straight, but let's go like this. If it's at an angle, then this dot here, or this pin right here, will have to stretch a long ways to reach the paper because the backing here is far away. So what you'll see then is, let me draw another piece of paper here. You might see words that appear faintly over here on this side, but they appear much more distinctly over as they get to the right side as the print head goes across and it gets to the part where it's closer and closer and closer on this roller. Then these pins don't have to travel very far, and they can get maximum impact when they strike that paper because the roller behind it is closer to the head. So that's a sure symptom. If you print something out, it's faint over on one side and darker over to the other side, that's a good indication that this roller is not properly aligned. You might have to use a Phillips head screwdriver to unscrew whatever attaches that roller into place, but a lot of them also have a tool-less adjustments where you can just use your fingers to unscrew something or to release a latch of some kind and reposition that particular roller. And then finally, the other kind of thing you'll run into with this is a lot of times these tractor feed things don't work so good. So it might be that someone has misfed the paper, and instead of getting one of these little spikes on the wheel into the hole that's there, it instead just hits a place where there is no hole, and so it causes the paper to get all askew in the printer, and very often, especially because these dot matrix can be very high speed, then if the printer is still trying to print with this all jammed up in there, you get a whole bunch of paper just wadded up into the rollings of this printer. It's a big, big mess. And then these tractor feeds, because they're perforated anyway, they tear off real easy, and those can be a huge mess to clean up. Another thing to think about, and I don't think this is going to be an A+ thing, but just an FYI, are two other things. Number one, these can be extremely loud, especially high volume industrial ones can print out, for example, maybe a page per second. So they're extremely fast, some of these things. And those types you're probably not going to see for the average consumer, but for, again, industrial use or something else which has a high quantity of paper, high quantity of reports, for example, that they might need to print out. But because of the fast speed of them, everything is more violent. This head motion, the carriage along which the head is attached, everything is very fast and violent. It can be very, very loud. So you may need to take that in consideration in terms of a proper working environment. And because of the violence with which these pins hit the paper, you're bound to have a lot more dust in that environment as well. And that dust can eventually kind of gum up the workings inside of the printer. The rollers might not roll quite as well after a period of time and so forth. So just keep an eye out for that dust. And then the next type of printer you might see would be a thermal printer, also known as a thermal wax printer, because they use melted wax to be able to create the print. And that's exactly what I mentioned here when I say that we use a wax-based ribbon with these. You see, what happens is there's a wide print head that is lined up with that ribbon, and when it's time to print something out, a signal is sent to the print head to heat up only certain parts of that head, and wherever it heats up, pins on the head will melt that wax right onto the paper. And you can't just use any kind of paper for this. It has to be that greasy, kind of waxy feeling paper, kind of like we used to have back in the days of the original fax machines. And yes, I'm old enough to remember when the fax machines were invented. I remember they used to cost thousands of dollars, and only the most well-to-do executives could possibly afford a real fax machine. Nowadays, you can get much better ones for $29.95 over at Staples or something. But in the old days, they also used this thermal wax, and we thought that was just kind of going to go away and we wouldn't have to mess with it anymore. But it turns out that it works out really well for retail environments to continue to use this waxy paper and thermal printing possibilities here. And that's why we have these at retail applications, because they're very inexpensive in terms of the overall cost for the printout. They're also very, very fast. I mean, after all, let's face it, in retail environments, all they want to do is to bring a customer in, get them to buy something, hand them their receipt, and send them out the door. So the faster you can get that receipt printed out and handed to them, the better off they are. And here's where I detract for a moment to mention one of my pet peeves. And why am I saying this on recorded video in front of thousands and thousands, maybe millions of people? Because I've got a microphone and you don't, so I get to say what I want. One of my peeves is you go to Walmart, you buy something, they put it all in the bag, and then they hold that receipt right in front of your face as if to say, hurry it up, there's people waiting behind you, we want to make as much money as we can, grab the receipt. I can't even put my wallet away yet, and they got this receipt hanging in my face. Maybe that's one of your peeves too, but anyway. If so, maybe I speak for all of us when I talk about that peeve, but that's because of the nature of this kind of printing and retail environment. They want everything to be fast. The other advantage, though, is that it's also a very quiet printer. You really barely even hear anything when it prints these things out. Because unlike the dot matrix, it doesn't use violence to be able to use any kind of an impact. And unlike lasers, the engine to be able to print all of this out does not create anywhere near as much noise. Also, by the way, as compared to other kinds of printers, especially like compared to laser printers, electrically speaking, they're very inexpensive. It does not take anywhere near as much electricity to create a receipt like this or a document like this using thermal as it would using a laser printer, which uses amazing amounts of electricity. And then just as a quick side note, also note that these kind of printouts are not for archival purposes. My dad, a few years ago, handed me several receipts from things that he had bought for a house that he built, and he said, I can't read these receipts anymore, and he thought it was just his eyes, so he handed them to me. I said, Dad, what you're handing me here is a bunch of blank receipts. There's nothing on them. Because you see, over time, this kind of thermal wax papery stuff, the ink just fades off of it. It may also not be very hardy because if it's rubbing up against other documents or if it's in your wallet for a while and just the friction eventually will rub off all the lettering on here. So remember, not for archival purposes. If it's a receipt for something pretty important, you probably just need to shoot a copy of it. Now, the first two types of printers I talked about, the impact printers like the dot matrix, and the thermal printers like the thermal wax, are really only useful for black and white. The white is the paper itself, and the black would be the characters that are printed on the page. There's no fine gradations of gray, or there's no color involved in them. So if you do want something like color, one way you could go would be to go to solid ink. With this, ink is melted and then sprayed onto the paper. It's kind of like when I was a kid, a young child, my sisters and I decided it would be fun to turn on the stove in our kitchen, take our box of crayons, and start to melt all of our crayons on the burners of that stove. It was really funny until my dad came in and caught us. And then he corrected the error of our ways, something that years of therapy still hasn't been able to fix. No, I'm just kidding about that, but he certainly did correct us, I'll tell you about that. And then what happens with this kind of a printer is that after the ink is melted, it then goes through a nozzle and it's sprayed onto the paper. And this is much like an inkjet printer or a bubble jet printer, which we'll talk about shortly here. But the basic idea here is it starts off as a solid ink. Now, why would we want to use a printer like this? Well, it's generally useful for a business quality type of a print. For example, if a business person wanted to create a transparency, they could use a solid ink printer to do that. And this has advantages over laser printers, which some people accidentally do at times. You should never take a transparency and feed it through a laser printer because there's a very hot process in the laser called fusing, which we'll talk about later, and it can melt that transparency and potentially ruin all or parts of that printer. So instead what we would use is these solid ink printers, which still has a heat process because it has to melt the ink, but it's nowhere near as hot as a laser printer. Now, some of you, if you're pretty young and you're getting started in your careers, you think, transparencies, sounds familiar. What are those things? Well, back when I was growing up and when I was in school and college and early in business, we didn't have laptops with PowerPoint. We just had transparencies that we would use on an overhead projector, and you can use markers and things where you could send them through a printer like a solid ink printer and have color transparencies, and if you did that, you were really fancy. Now, I know I'm old. It used to be right before that we would just use a hammer and a chisel and we'd carve our message in stone. That's how we did it. So back when we were using transparencies, we thought we were pretty high tech. And then these solid ink printers are also very useful for creating things like reports and graphs or booklets for like meetings and things like this because of the fact that solid ink generally gives you a very vibrant color. And that's what we often like to see in reports and graphs or where we're trying to say how well our company is doing. You know, this bright, vibrant colored graph that shows, increased sales, up and up and up and only good. That kind of looks nice on paper. Now, I'll also say something else about solid ink as a general business purpose. The main competitor for solid ink will be color laser printers. They both have their own purposes and everything, but solid ink is generally going to give you a very low cost per page. The printer itself will be kind of expensive, but price per page is going to be generally inexpensive, and it also prints on a wide variety of types of media. For example, as I mentioned earlier, some laser printers, you don't usually want to put a transparency in them because they might melt, whereas with a solid ink, you could use a solid ink printer to print out on transparencies and other kinds of media. Very often the solid ink printer also uses a very simple paper path, so it's not going to go through 12 or 15 different rollers that can potentially jam up or twist the paper around and give you other complications that you might get with some laser printers. Now here's just an example. I've gone to Xerox's web page, and if you want to make a note here, you can go there. But if you just go to Xerox.com, you'll eventually be able to get your way here through these links to color printers. And Xerox has both color lasers as well as the Phaser 8560, which is an ink printer, a solid ink printer. That's really all you need to know for the A+. In fact, I've already told you more than you really need for A+ purposes. But if you want to know more details about how solid ink printing works, scroll down on one of these pages and look at this link here for how does solid ink work. It gives it like, oh, I don't know, it's probably 6 or 8 steps in what happens. Very useful information, and it's pretty cool. Now, with ink dispersion printers, we'll often hear these referred to as inkjet printers, or you might hear them referred to as bubble jet printers. Inkjet is more likely to be around nowadays than bubble jets, but I'll talk about those here shortly. First of all, what happens here is we have a liquid ink. Remember, with our previous topic, we were talking about solid ink, where it just kind of melts a crayon, if you will. Here we have liquid ink, and it usually appears in tanks. There can usually be 3, 4, 6, or more colors, depending on the purpose and the kind of printer that's involved there. So if I just start off with 3, for example, then what we would have is 3 different colors, and it's usually some form of, let's say, yellow. I'll just go to all these. We'll have yellow, and then we'll have cyan, which is some shade of blue. I'll just go with this one for now. We have cyan, and then we have magenta. Okay, so we have these 3 colors that come out. Now, I mentioned earlier that you can make just about any color if you use red, green, and blue. You can also do the same, and this is usually what we do in printing, is we use yellow, cyan, and magenta to combine colors to come up with some other color. Red, green, and blue is usually used for on-screen color displays. So whatever monitor you're using right now is an RGB-based monitor. Whereas if you print out a really nice photograph, for example, it's going to be using some form of yellow, cyan, and magenta. Now, what about black? How would I get black? Well, you'd get black by using all 3 colors, but the problem is those are the ones that only use three ink tanks in the printer, and if you combine all these together to get a black, you're usually going to get something that's not really a very true black, or it might still have a slight color cast to it. So if you're a photographer, for example, and you want a high color print, you're not going to be using one of those with just 3 tanks in it. If you're just a business person that just wants some color, it doesn't have to be true accurate color, then maybe the 3-tank system would work fine for you. Now, most printers these days, just because of the marketplace, don't use 3. They'll have at least 4. Oh, that was a mess. They'll have at least 4 colors, and the reason why is because in addition to the other colors that I talked about there, they will also now include their own black. And now that we have our own black in there that we can also use, anything that is truly black will not be the muddy combination of all 3 of these. It'll be a true black. And using the ink there in black, we can use only a percentage of black out of those nozzles where the black is shooting out to give ourselves various shades of gray. Higher end printers, and I'm thinking of photographers here because I'm a photographer myself, and I've got some printers that do fine photo prints. Well, you can go into more tanks. You can go to 6 tanks, and what these will often have is still yellow, cyan, and magenta, and then it'll have black, and then it'll have another shade of black. I'm not going to do any shading here, but we'll have 2 or 3 shades of black to account for different gray tones that appear within an image, and these will give you extremely fine resolution, extremely high quality photographic and archival prints for photographers. I use Epson printers, and a lot of those are now going to 8 colors, which again is just various gradations of black. Some of them might also use yellow, cyan, light cyan, magenta, light magenta, black, light black, medium black, different shades of all those things. So you get up to about 8 colors there. All right, so then how does the actual printing process take place? Well, it can either be thermal or it can be pressure forced. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to get this ink to spray out of a nozzle and to hit the paper. With the thermal method, what happens is there's a small, a very almost microscopic heating process that takes place where it instantly heats up to a very high temperature, and of course when something heats it expands. Well, because of that, the ink that's in front of that heating surface will expand to the point where it bursts out onto the page. And now there's also the pressure forced method, which is what most of them use now. The thermal method we often used with what we call bubble jet, because when it heats up underneath that ink, then it creates a bubble of the ink until it gets to a point where it expands out of the nozzle and shoots out of the nozzle. Those are bubble jet printers. Years ago, Canon kind of pioneered that, but even Canon doesn't always use bubble jet anymore. I think they're mostly using inkjet now. And Epson and HP are also using inkjet. So when we talk about ink dispersion nowadays, we're mostly thinking inkjet, and it uses pressure. I'll just go ahead and put over here bubble, just for your information. And then here would be inkjet. Okay, let me just abbreviate it with inkjet. So the pressure, what happens with that is there's going to be a kind of a something like, and it's not always the same with every printer, but something kind of like a diaphragm behind that ink, and it will expand and contract in kind of a semicircular motion, so that when it expands, it forces ink out of the nozzle by that pressure. Then the ink just kind of goes splat onto the page. Now, to me, this is just my human thinking. It's hard for me to imagine how this could possibly be accurate or neat. I mean, when I think about ink shooting out of a nozzle, I think of, who was that, Jim Belushi in Animal House, who was simulating a pimple with mayonnaise. If you have ever seen the story, then you know what I'm talking about. How in the world could that possibly be neat, to have ink just shooting out of a nozzle? Or if you want to think of it another way, if you haven't seen the movie, think of shooting a paintball at a wall. When that paintball hits the wall, what happens? Well, it splatters all over the place, and it starts dense in the middle, and then it splats, like this. This is what we call satelliting, or a satellite thing, where all the ink sprays out all over the place. Well, there are a couple things that are going on here. Number one, because the print head, where the nozzles are, is so close to the page, number one, we're able to get a very precise dispersion of the ink onto the page. And number two, the nozzles are so microscopic that any satelliting that takes place is imperceptible to the human eye anyway. The higher the quality and the more professional the printer with inkjet printers, and again, I'm thinking mostly of printers that photographers would use, the less and less you're going to be able to see of any kind of satelliting to the naked eye. So again, an inkjet printer, an ink dispersion printer, will use these nozzles out of which come the various shades of ink. And if you're able to open up the cover of a printer, a photo printer as it's printing, sometimes you can see the head moving back and forth, and you can see it laying down various gradations of each one of these colors, and it's kind of interesting to watch. One thing to keep in mind with ink dispersion printers is that they usually use a very specific liquid ink. So for example, if I use Canon printers, I should buy only Canon ink. You can't get generic ink or other brands of ink. But to get the highest quality, I need to use the Canon ink and Canon papers. I use Epson, so I use, again, Epson ink and Epson papers. So the paper is kind of specialized. You can get genericized paper if you're only trying to print out very draft quality prints of some kind, or your purpose is not to get exact photographic reproduction. You just need to get a color brochure printed out where there's no skin tones or photographs of flowers or anything like that. If it's all going to be bar charts and black and white and things like that, then it probably won't much matter which paper you get, as long as it's not too thick for the printer. This is something that does take place, especially with laser printers, which we'll discuss, where you don't want to use a paper that's thicker than the manufacturer will recommend, because that can create a jam. With a lot of these photo quality ink dispersion printers, they're able to handle very heavy types of paper. For example, a friend of mine who does work for Better Homes and Gardens, he's a photographer for them, he sent me one of my prints. I emailed him the file. He printed it out for me, sent it back. It's on this really nice, thick, kind of a canvas paper. It's just beautiful, but I know that would never have fit in my printer. But he was able to use that special paper in his printer. Of course, his printer is, I don't know, it's like 48 inches wide, and it costs about $6,000. Now, in terms of the business expense of this, there's also a trade-off, which you'll very quickly see. First of all, the printer is cheap. Before I had this printer, I had an Epson, I think it was a C64, which is a very, very basic, generic kind of printer. I think it used 4 inks. The printer I got at the local Fry's Electronics store, and if I remember right, it was somewhere under $30. It was a remanufactured unit. It was very, very cheap, and I got all the ink included with it. But then when I went to replace the ink, because my kids had decided to print out a whole bunch of of photographs over one weekend and I ran out of ink in one weekend. I went back to replace it. The inks, if I replaced all of them at once, would have cost me $50. That's where these people make their money. The expense of the ink. They could care less about the printer itself in certain ways, in terms of profit anyway. The ink is where they make their money. Now, just for FYI, people have complained about this for a long time, and Canon, HP, Epson, all the major printers have made a fortune off of the ink, and I don't think there's any arguing that. Kodak is on the horizon with a new set of printers where they're going to give us high-quality inks at a low price. I don't know how that's going to work out yet, but if you're interested in color printing or photo printing, keep your eye on Kodak. So the advantage here with ink dispersion methods, in summary, is that if you want photo quality prints, you're going to get extremely high quality prints out of these. They're not like the early inkjet printers, which just look like crap. You're going to get very high quality out of these, and they're also usually considered archival. If you get photo printers with quality inks, archival meaning that they can survive 100 years without a dramatic fade in vibrancy or color rendition. But again, they're expensive. They can be as high as about 25 cents per page. So if you add up a lot of prints, that gets to be pretty high. In terms of other business purposes besides photographers, you'll see a lot of ink dispersion printers in multi-function units or multi-function printers. Just depends on who you talk to. And these are multi-function items that have printing and faxing and copying and scanning and all those different kinds of things that you see at any office supply store nowadays. Very useful, especially for small businesses, because we may not have a lot of office space and we don't want a separate desk space or separate counter space for a scanner and a printer and a copier and all those things. It's all in a single unit now. Probably the most commonly used printer in business, however, is going to be the laser printer. Everybody's seen these somewhere. I'm sure you've used them and so forth. But laser printers do use an actual laser to be able to create their image on a drum. And overall, the reason why we like lasers is because they're very fast. I guess I'm out of order here, but they're fast and they're relatively inexpensive per page. But you pretty much just get monochrome prints. Now, you can get color with color lasers, but that's kind of a different topic. Generally, in terms of business purposes, you're going to get monochrome prints, which will be black, the color of the toner, and then you'll get white color, the paper, and then you can also get various gradations of gray in between, depending on how much toner is used. So for example, you could print a photograph out on a laser printer, maybe a photograph of a friend or something like that, and it would come out just fine. It would be all black and white, just like a black and white print would be, but it still is not just only black and only white. Now, we do have flexible print media with these as well. You can use cardstock, you can print out various kinds of business cards, those things you get from Avery at the office supply store, for example, where they're perforated. You print out a whole sheet of business cards, and then you fold them up and tear them apart. So you can get that kind of a printout. Some you can use transparencies with. Part of that may depend on exactly where the fuser is located in the printer. Because if it's located deep inside the printer, a little bit too far before the page actually comes out, and if it has to go around a curve or through a roller or around a bend or something, then that transparency may get caught and melted and cause a big mess. On the other hand, if the fuser is real close to the end of the printer, and very often that's the case, printer path, then you might be okay. Just check with the manufacturer to see what kind of print media they do allow. And then with laser printers, it's usually okay to use generic expendables. So if you get a cartridge that's from XYZ company that has the toner in it, that's usually okay. I mean, toner is toner is toner. It's not quite the same as with certain photographic purposes, where you should use Epson ink with Epson printers, for example. Now, in all fairness, for you photographers out there, and there's probably not a whole lot of you, but there are some companies that produce extremely high quality replacement inks that are not name brand, but they're still very good. But if you just go to the office supply store and it's Billy Joe Jim Bob's ink replacement for the Epson, you're probably not going to like it for photographs. But for laser printers, generic cartridges are usually okay. They're usually remanufactured, so they just take old cartridges from the original manufacturer and they might just refill them. One reason why we do that is because inside of almost all laser printers nowadays, inside of all the cartridges, is the actual drum, which actually is where the laser creates the image on the drum. Usually, that's going to be useful for many, many uses, whereas the toner, when it runs out of the cartridge, usually throw the whole thing away. Well, actually, the drum inside of it would have still been good if you could just reuse it. That's what a lot of companies do now. They just take those old discarded cartridges, and then they just continue to use the same drum inside and replace the toner. And of course, the big advantage there with using generics is that you're going to get a substantial discount compared to buying name brand cartridges. All right, now let's go ahead and talk about the laser printer 6 steps when a print job takes place. The first one is called the cleaning process. In order to facilitate this whole discussion of the 6 steps, I've used my expert artwork down here to illustrate what happens in a laser printing process. Of course, this is a logical diagram which just has representative parts of the laser printer. It doesn't show all parts of the printer, and that's my disclaimer and my apology for my horribly sorry artwork here. But here's what happens. This red line represents the paper path. At the beginning of the paper path, there's going to be a feed roller, or also known as a paper pickup roller, and it's going to be somewhat D-shaped usually, which is kind of going to allow it to grab the paper and to pull it into the printer. And then underneath on the bottom side, there's going to be a rubber separator pad, which is used to avoid taking 2 or more sheets of paper at once. That should help to ensure that only one piece of paper goes through. But to return to our existing discussion on cleaning, you see what's happened is while our current print job is already going through, there's probably already been a previous print job that's been recorded on this drum, and it's recorded by use of toner and electrical charges. So what we need to do is to return that toner to a clean state where it doesn't have any more toner on it and where it does not have the electrical charges which would mislead our existing print job. So in our little Mickey Mouse picture that we have here inside of our toner, what kind of things have we got going on to do the cleaning? First of all, we'll have to add something called a cleaning blade, which is kind of a squeegee that squeegees off the old toner from the drum so that we don't have any remnants of an existing print job on our new print job. And then we'll have something else that's going to be a light in here. You see, this drum is made of metal, but it's also photosensitive. It's coated with photosensitive material so that if it's exposed to light, its electrical charge gets neutralized. So what happens is we have the cleaning blade scrape off the old toner, and then in here somewhere, and I don't make room in my diagram for it, but there's usually a fluorescent bulb or a fluorescent light which exposes this drum to neutralize the electrical charges. So that takes care of the cleaning, and the next thing that we'll have here is something called conditioning, and sometimes it's also called charging. That's the next phase. That takes place with this cylindrical object right here. This could either be a corona wire, especially in older printers, or more currently, it's going to be known as a corona roller. This is an electrically charged roller which transfers a minus 600 volts, minus 600 volts of electricity onto this drum. The only reason why that's of any relevance at all is because in the writing process there will be a difference charge. You see, what happens next is in the writing phase there's going to be a laser beam. It does use a literal laser in a laser printer, and it goes through it passes through a focusing lens and an octagonal mirror. You don't need to memorize that, but that's what it does. And it does that to precisely write electrical charges onto this drum, because remember, it's photosensitive. So since we're using a laser, which is light, a focused beam of light, when it writes to this drum, so where maybe it's going to write on the letter A or the letter B or something like that, it will then, because of that light, change the electrical charge on that minus 600 volt drum to a minus 100 volts instead. And then in the developing process of all of this, this roller right here will become in contact with the toner, and it will then transfer a thin layer of toner onto this roller. Now the toner is also going to be at minus 600 volts, so minus 600 volts from the original conditioning plus the minus 600 volts of the toner is going to be neutralized. Therefore, it's not going to have any effect wherever that drum is at a minus 600 volts. However, wherever it's at a minus 100 volts, that's where the toner is going to be electrically attracted to that section of the drum. So wherever our laser wrote the letter A, for example, it's going to be a minus 100 volts. Our toner gets sucked onto it by means of static electricity to that portion of the drum. Now let me also be clear about something else that happens in this developing state. I mentioned that the toner has a charge of minus 600 volts. Well, in its storage state where it's just sitting there doing nothing, it doesn't actually have that charge. What really happens is this developing roller also has a charge of minus 600 volts. And then the toner, which is made up of black carbon particles, a black carbon substance, and polyester resins. The polyester resins help it to flow better so it doesn't chunk up inside of the process, or if I put that backwards, I guess it would be up chunk. Oh, okay, well, well, I hadn't told a joke for a while, so I thought I'd give it a try. And then finally, it has these iron oxide particles, and that's where it gets electrical. You see, since this roller is at minus 600 volts, then when the toner gets in contact with it, it adopts the same voltage as that roller. So the toner that's on this roller will also be at minus 600 volts. And then as these rotate, and my direction of rotation is this way, by the way, that drum is rotating this way, and this drum here will be rotating this way. I don't know if you can see the arrow there, but that direction. So then in the transferring stage, where we're minus 600 volts on this roller, it's going to have no effect on this drum. But where we have our minus 100, this toner is transferred in the transferring process to the drum, and then it's transferred to the paper. And here's where the real transferring process takes place. There's also another roller, I didn't really put it under here, but another roller that applies pressure to the paper up to the drum, and then it puts it in contact with this drum. There'll be a small slot or an opening underneath here where the paper can touch that drum. The paper will have also been charged. It has another corona of its own, where it will also be charged with a positive 600 volts. And now what's going to happen is, because it's at a positive 600 volts and the toner is at that's on this drum is at a minus 100 volts, they will attract to one another, and so this toner will transfer to the paper because of the difference in electrical voltage. Then it passes on through the process, and then before it exits the printer, it'll go through a couple of other rollers. Here's a roller to apply pressure to this top unit right here, and this is called the fuser. This fuser generates a lot of heat. It uses a halogen light inside of it to generate lots of heat, and it's usually around 380 degrees or somewhere in that range. And then as a result of that high level of heat, it melts that toner directly onto the page as it comes out of the printer. Same process, really, in that part of it that a copier would use. That's why when you pick up a fresh print job off of the printer, it's still warm, because it's had that fuser that's heated up the toner onto it. So that's our fusing process here. Also, before it gets out of the printer, there's another process in here where there's some wires that come in contact with the paper that will eliminate the electrical charge on that paper. Because remember, earlier in this process, it was given a plus 600 volt charge. Now, these laser printer steps are really not important to memorize in and of themselves, but it's kind of useful in terms of troubleshooting, because you need to know these things so you can identify where a problem might be occurring. For example, if on your page, at the top of the page it's dark, and at the middle of the page it's light, and the bottom of the page it's dark again, there could be an inconsistency in this drum. You can't really usually replace the drum itself, so you'll have to just replace the entire cartridge if that were the case. But that's just an example of that. If you want to memorize these 6 steps, one of the commonly used acronyms for this, if we look at, or the mnemonics that we would use, is the CCWDTF. And that would be Charlie can walk, dance, and talk French. Okay, so I'll write that up here in just a moment so you can look at that a little bit better. But Charlie can walk, dance, talk French. And here it is on the whiteboard here. If you want to pause the recording and make a note of that, you can. Charlie can walk, dance, and talk French, the mnemonic for cleaning, conditioning, or charging, writing, developing, transferring, and fusing. All right, let's talk about some of the other options and or upgrades that you can apply to your printers here as well, or to your customers' printers, and that would be, first of all, memory. Now, for some printers, such as thermal printers, impact printers, and the like, that only print one line at a time, memory is not too much of an issue, because it only has to maintain enough memory to print one line on that page, and that's not usually too bad. Usually 16 kilobytes or 32 kilobytes is more than enough to print one line. For laser printers, it's usually going to be a lot different, though, because it has to hold in memory the entire page at once before it can send the job out to the laser to write onto the drum. So with laser printers, usually you'll have somewhere a minimum of 4 megabytes, and you might have upwards of 64 megabytes, depending on the kind of jobs that are done. If it's just general office memos and things like that, 4 megabytes will be fine. If someone's using high-end graphics with extreme amount of detail or something like that, you might need a large number of megabytes to be installed in that printer. Check with the printer manufacturer about what kind of printer memory you can put in there. Some of it will be proprietary that you can only buy from that manufacturer, and others will allow you to use just any kind of almost generic dual inline memory module. such as the current DDR memory that's out there on the market. And for more about memory, just review our recent video that we did on memory in this same series. Another thing you could put in there would be hard drives. This also goes to those print locations where they're printing extremely complex or large print jobs, because the amount of data might not be able to be stored in memory alone, so it can be spooled off and stored onto the hard drives instead. Another issue there might be things such as the fonts. For desktop publishing and graphic design businesses, they would like to be able to use a large number of fonts for every type of print job that's available. So if they have a lot of fonts that need to be used, the printer resident fonts can also be stored on that hard drive. The other place you might need to use hard drives, or at least have plenty of hard drive space available, and or fast hard drives, maybe even a RAID array, would be on print servers. This goes outside the scope of A+ a bit. It goes more into a server plus objective there. But a lot of times what we'll have here is a server. Maybe this is, I'll just put S for server, and then I'll have over here my printer. This server has a direct attachment to this printer, but other people on the network attach through the network to this server, and everybody wants to ultimately print out to this printer. So what they'll do is they'll send their print job to this server, and it'll have a hard drive in it, and it will be spooling or storing everybody's print jobs from all over the network. So I need to make sure that, number one, I have a fast enough hard drive or a RAID solution, and number two, that it has enough space on it, especially if my users send large or complex print jobs, so that they can go out to the printer. Another thing you'll often see in printers these days are network interface cards. This might be with Hewlett-Packard something called a Jet Direct card, although the A+ doesn't test us on the names of these things. But the network interface card simply makes this printer yet another member of the network, so that it'll have its own IP address, and usually you'll use the buttons in the panel on the printer to configure its IP address, or you could use something called DHCP, which means it will automatically receive an IP address from another network device or another server. Once it has that IP address, it has a unique identity on the network, and then we can set up each individual out here to not even use a print server if we don't want them to, so instead that they could just print directly to that printer over the network. Another option for that network interface card, if we have one right here, maybe that's how it's connected, is that we have this server connected through the network to this printer, and then once that's installed that way, in terms of Windows installation, the server will think that that printer is a local printer, so that it just the same as if it was attached through a parallel port or serial or USB port. Then what we can do is to share that printer via Windows, and then now once it's shared, other hosts out here on the network will see that shared printer on the server, print to it, and then this server will print over the network, usually Ethernet network, to this network card that's attached to this printer. Now, if you don't have a printer that has a network interface card on it, but you want one, you might be able to check with the manufacturer to see if they supply one, or you could just buy a Jet Direct device or some other similar type of a print server device, which would allow you to plug, for example, a parallel port into the device, and then elsewhere on that device will be an RJ45 jack for the network connection, and then you configure everything on that device. So it's kind of an intermediary device or an intermediate device. And then we also have additional trays or additional types of feeders. So for example, with photo printers, you can put a large roll of paper at the back of the printer, and then when it prints a job out, it even has a cutter inside of it, so it just spools that paper through the printer. When it gets to the end, it has its own razor or cutting device that cuts off that paper, and that would use a special kind of a feeder. Usually we only use those in print houses or in high-volume photographers' print shops. And then you might also have additional trays. This is something that we'll more commonly see, where you'll put an additional tray down here, and this might have letter-sized paper, and then another tray that has legal-sized paper. And when the user out here on the network somewhere prints their print job, the print driver will specify whether it needs letter or legal-sized paper. Might also have another tray down here that just has envelopes, and another one that has card stock. So all those different kinds of things are a possibility, and we usually stack the printer on top of additional multiple trays down here. Then you may also have a finisher that you can attach to it, and that would be, where maybe the paper comes out of this side of the printer. It would be something that might be able to staple or collate or sort or do something else like that, something that you'd probably more likely see on copiers. But the line between high production office laser printers and copiers is becoming blurred so that they're almost virtually the same thing and can very often perform the same functions. And then I mentioned a little bit earlier that a lot of these inkjet printers are combinations of scanners with faxes, fax capability in them as well, and you can also use them to copy things. There are also laser printers that have that capability as well, but of course they'll be a little bit more expensive. But if it doesn't have any of these things on them, with some of these devices, you can purchase these separately. You can purchase a scanner separately and attach it to the printer. You can purchase a fax modem and install it into the printer. But most of the time, we see these already integrated into the multifunction devices. Now then finally, let's talk about some printer interfaces. I won't spend a lot of time on this because we've talked about most of these interfaces in the past, but these are certainly things that you can use as a medium to be able to print to a printer. First of all, there's the traditional parallel printer cable. The 1284 version of the cable, of course, is going to be the bidirectional type that you can use with ECP or EPP ports on the computer, and we've talked about that in the past. Then there's, of course, the network interface, which is why we'd have a network interface card inside of the printer or a network interface device that we can use instead. We can also use SCSI. Now, I didn't talk about that very much. We talked about SCSI a while back, primarily in relation to hard drives, but we can also have SCSI printers. The fact of the matter is, however, it's mostly been supplanted by USB as an alternative method for the attachment interface. Primarily because SCSI is expensive and USB is inexpensive, and SCSI is wide and takes up a lot of space, and the engineers have to plan for that wide connector, whereas USB takes up relatively little space. And then there's also infrared. We don't see these a lot either, but they certainly are out there. And this is where I could, this is very useful for things such as my PDA. So I might have a PDA that has infrared capability and I want to print something out, but I don't have a cable or an attachment to be able to plug a big old giant 36-pin parallel port cable into my PDA. So what instead I could use is the wireless signal of infrared. Infrared doesn't work very well from great distances, so if you're within a few feet of the device, you should be able to print from something like a PDA or a tablet computer to a printer. And then there's serial ports as well. Again, we don't see those much in the consumer arena anymore, but in some manufacturing and retail environments, we still use that, primarily for dot matrix printers. And then there's 1394, which is FireWire. For PCs, we rarely see 1394 attachments to printers, but they are available, and so just be aware of the fact that's another thing that we could use. Again, 1394 is another way of talking about FireWire. And then finally, we have wireless. And wireless can really take two forms. The first of all would just be a conventional wireless network, an IEEE 802.11 wireless network. And your printer may have the built-in capability for that. So it might already have a built-in network card that sends and receives wireless signals. And then we just have to join it to our wireless network. The other option there might be Bluetooth. Remember that Bluetooth capabilities are going to give me a maximum theoretical range of maybe 100 meters. However, they usually work best within 10 meters. So I could take my Palm device or my handheld computer and be able to print using Bluetooth to a Bluetooth-enabled printer. In this nugget, we took a look at printers, and this was part one, where we started off by just looking at the various types of printer technologies that are available. Dye sub, solid ink, inkjet, laser, dot matrix, all those kinds of things. And we specifically also took a look at the laser 6 steps in the printing process, which can eventually help also, hopefully, to narrow down what the cause of a problem might be in troubleshooting. And then we took a look at some of the options and upgrades. Do you want to add a scanner to that printer? Do you want to add more memory? Or can you upgrade a hard drive inside of the printer? Some of those printers do actually have a hard drive to store lots of fonts and a lot of page data. So those are kind of handy. And then we took a look at the various interfaces. Remember, older technologies such as serial are not used as much anymore except for industrial and retail environments. You're more likely to see potentially wireless, including Bluetooth and 802.11, as well as IEEE 1284 connections using a parallel port, as well as USB ports. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.